Hey guys, Talkaholics, thank you guys for being here today. Today I'm going to be talking about Russian oil. Finally decided to do it, been thinking about making this video for a while. I'd like to mention a few things before I get started. The oil industry is complicated, it's difficult to predict, and another thing is that I'm not comparing every company in the world, but I'm kind of cherry picking some. So maybe there are some companies out there that would be better than Russian oil. But from what I have looked at, I really like the Russian oil industry. This here is the price to produce a barrel of oil by country. It's not a perfect measurement of every company's costs, but it gives you a pretty good idea. You can see up here at the top, the United Kingdom has a very high cost to produce a barrel of oil, and United States, somewhere in the middle. You can see down here, we have Russia clocking in near the bottom in terms of price. But you'll notice that some of these Middle Eastern countries, like Iran, UAE, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, they can produce oil cheaper. But you might also want to consider some of the political factors in those kinds of places. So if you're paying $5 more for a barrel of oil, but you don't have to worry about your refinery getting hit in a missile strike, might be a good thing. Something else to think about is governments around the world. This here is the fiscal break-even oil price for some countries around the world. You can see that Russia is not one of these. These are countries that are highly dependent on their oil industries to fund their government. So one way you can think about that is if they rely very heavily on that oil industry to make money, then some of that those profits that your company could be realizing might be taken away, or might be going to the government to kind of balance their budget instead of your investment, right? So Saudi Arabia, for example, has very low production costs, but they have an expensive government. And on top of that, almost all of their revenues for their government, I think it's almost 87%, something like that, comes through the oil industry. Whereas if you're in Russia, yes, a lot of the government's budget does come from the oil industry there too. It's true, but it's also diversified in away from not only the oil industry, but in the mining sector, and as well as some other industries to generate that revenue. All right, so I put this together. This is a few comparisons between some oil majors. Again, I'm kind of cherry picking here. Maybe you'll find a better oil company around the world, or better oil major with some better stats, but I've selected some, and the main reason I think I've selected these is to kind of show you guys Russian oil, particularly when we're comparing it to some Western countries' oil majors. So for example, here I have Exxon, Shell, and BP, and you can see that their debt to equity ratios much higher than when we're considering Lukoil, Gazprom, some Russian oil majors. Now I'd also like to mention Gazprom is constructing two major pipelines, so a lot of their costs are likely to have some high yield returns, whereas I don't think these kinds of companies' investment projects will likely yield as high of a return as Gazprom's. Now, you can also see in this second chart, we have dividend yield percents. The dividends that you're receiving for these companies is actually lower than what you would receive from some Russian ones. In this third column, we have a PE median over the last 13 years. The reason I've selected 13 years is because that was a lifetime of available data on this website, Guru Focus. You can see we have PEs in maybe the 14s and 13s in some of these Western oil companies compared to PEs that are very low in Russian companies. The reason I've selected a median is because the oil industry is very volatile, so it's kind of all over the place. If you just select a PE from a random point in time, I don't think it gives you a good of a picture as if you take a PE over an average. Now there's another way you could think about this too, and you could say, well, why are all these Western countries commanding higher PEs and Russian ones commanding lower ones? Maybe that's a different way to think about it. Maybe it's this is a good thing and this is actually a bad thing. It's just think about it from another perspective. Yeah. But there's the final column, and this is the share price appreciation. You can see over the last 5 years, these have had negative returns in Western countries. Saudi Aramco IPO'd last year. So, but since then, their shares have been roughly flat, which is actually pretty good considering the conditions of the market we've been in. Yeah. However, Lukoil and Gazprom over the last 5 years, have returned 130% and 55%, not including those dividends. Something else I think is interesting to consider is the national budgets of some countries around the world. You can see that in those Western countries, they have very, very high debts, and Russia, low compared to some of those other ones. I also included Saudi Arabia, although they do have a higher debt to GDP. Like I mentioned before, a lot of their funding is going to come from the oil industry compared to Russia, which has a fraction of the revenues for their government coming from oil compared to Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Something else to think about is some of the trends you're seeing in Western countries where the oil industries are heavily vilified. I would like you guys to think about this, that let's suggest that we do enter the bull cycle for the oil industry. If the United States, Netherlands, and Great Britain have these extremely high debts, and they dislike the oil and gas industry, that is the zeitgeist of the West, what do you guys think that they will do to these oil companies when they see that these companies are actually earning money instead of losing it? They're probably going to institute things like carbon credits, and they'll do things like that to kind of take away, I think, some of the returns that you could receive from these companies. Whereas I don't think that that's necessarily the case in Russia compared to some of the other Western countries. I think a lot of the oil industry could come down to politics as well. Here we have Mr. Vladimir Putin, and I think he's an extremely competent national leader, and he's dedicated to the success of his national oil industry. The success of Russia depends on the oil industry, and Putin knows this. Now, when you listen to some of his interviews or questions with press and things like that, he acknowledges things like global warming, but he also acknowledges diverse opinions on what could cause these kinds of things. And I think that he may or may not necessarily agree with the global warming narrative, but he understands that saying the right thing is important to appease his trading partners. He also understands the oil industry, and he knows and uses it. So last year, if you guys don't know, there was an oil war that kind of spiked between, or the popular narrative was that it was between Saudi Arabia and Russia, where they were pumping oil, even though there was lockdowns around the world. They were increasing the oil supply. The reason I think that this wasn't because from a spat between Russia and Saudi Arabia, but rather that this guy, he understood the dynamics of the oil industry, and he decided to take advantage of what was going on to kind of improve his condition in the market. One of the things that has been kind of a thorn to the oil industry in the last decade or so has been the shale industry in the United States. One of the issues with the shale industry, though, is that they're very high debt, and they need a high amount of they need a high oil price to maintain profitability. So if you understand this dynamic and you understand you see other oil industries around the world as your competitors, and you flood the market in a time of stress, you can lever yourself and put your country in a very good position. And I think we've seen that, and I think that's going to continue to happen. If we have a very competent leader who's willing to play ball for the benefit of the oil industry, that's a huge plus in my book. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. Okay, this is a Russian population histogram. You might be thinking, well, why on earth are you showing this to me? What does this have to do with the Russian oil industry? I think that this is important. This is actually one of the things I think about when I decide to invest in a foreign country. I made a video on this. You can look that up. It's where I talk about population dynamics and how I think that it's useful information for thinking about inflows and outflows over long periods of time in certain countries. So here we can see this is a Russian population histogram. What we really want to look at is not so much the females because, sorry, ladies, they don't tend to invest nearly at the rates that men do. And you can actually see that on my YouTube channel. I think 100%, according to YouTube, of my viewers are men. So, sorry, ladies, they don't matter in this context. Okay, so what is important? I'm not going to go into huge detail, but these, if you're very interested in this, you can watch that video that I made before again. But you can see that these investment age males in Russia, their population is increasing. And what that means is there's likely to be more money inflows into the Russian stock market over the next decade or so. And you can see around here, as opposed to the amount of people who are retiring and likely selling shares in their companies during their retirement age. So you can see that this is increasing. And a lot of these over here to about 1991, they're very likely just starting to become investment age, as opposed to the amount of people leaving and that are no longer in that investment window is smaller. So I expect to see more inflows into the Russian stock market over time. Now, one of a couple of the biggest companies in Russian stock market in those indexes is Lukoil and Gazprom, two of those companies that I mentioned before. Now, I kind of wanted to show you guys this briefly to kind of think about the next slide. These are the kinds of ways that countries generate their energy from the different kinds of sources. You can see over the last 10 years or so, the amount of coal has been declining. However, the amount of oil and gas in terms of energy generation has been increasing around the world. And you can see that for all of the hype that these rebuildables technologies have, they're nowhere near to supplanting oil and gas in its dominance. Now, there is one industry that I pay attention to that I think is actually capable of replacing the oil industry at some point, and that is nuclear energy. If you see this increasing around the world, it is actually a superior energy source compared to the rebuildable industry. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because of this. Now, Russia's biggest customers for their oil and gas are Europe and China, some of their neighbors, right? One thing that's interesting to see is that Europe has been reducing their nuclear energy over time. They've been divesting from it, which is a terrible decision, in my opinion, but that's theirs to make, I suppose. What this means is that there's likely to be an increase in energy generation from some of those other methods, whether that be coal, oil, and gas. And since coal is highly pollutant compared to the other two, I think that's a good thing for Russian oil, yeah? Now, the other side of that, though, China is a lot more pragmatic than I think a lot of Western countries. They've been heavily investing in nuclear, and you can see that. And if that trend continues, we might see some decline in the oil demand in China over time. Now, on the flip side of that, China is GDP and their standards of living for their people have consistently been increasing. So although there might be viability if in terms of things like electric vehicles, if they power them through nuclear instead of traditional other methods, I suppose, I still expect that there's going to be an increase in oil demand because first of all, China is a highly exporting nation, and oil is used as a derivative for all kinds of products. So even if a worst case scenario for Russian oil over a long period of time is that uh, China is able to have an electric fleet. I still think that they are very likely to be increasing in oil consumption. One thing I found very interesting is this, and I had no idea about this until I saw this today. This came from Sven Carlin. I'm not sure where he found this, but this was in one of his videos. And it's this, it's that cars have run out of gas. Despite all the buzz about how electric vehicles will reshape transportation, the real transformation in the auto business has been consumers racing away from traditional cars and towards light trucks. And these aren't electric vehicles. What people have been doing over time since the 2000s is they're buying less of those smaller kind of compact vehicles, and instead they are purchasing SUVs, light trucks, minivans. These have higher gas consumption compared to some of the models in um, the compact market. Yeah. So this is a question too. I mean, this might just be a trend in the United States, but let's suggest that it's not, and maybe it's something that's happening around the world. The question is, will oil demand, despite all of the hype around the electrification, actually increase in because of consumer tastes? It's a question I think is worth asking. All right, so this is what I'm doing. This is an investment advice. I might make money, I might lose money. What I'm doing shouldn't matter. You should maybe think about some of my ideas, but then look at some diverse opinions and come to your own conclusions. Now, I've been buying Gazprom and Lukoil since last year, late summer, I think, September. And I'm still buying. I'm still scaling into these positions. I'm willing to have 10 to 15% allocation to these kinds of stocks in my overall portfolio. But you should know that oil is a cyclical industry, and it's often difficult to predict. I don't plan to hold these forever, but I don't have a plan to exit these either. As you know, the dividends for some of these companies are very nice, and I'm willing to sit to kind of and see and reevaluate where we are in a cycle as we go. Yeah. If and when we see oil prices head to triple digits, where we see that, like that happened a few times in the past, I'm probably going to exit those companies. The reason for that is if you see very, very high oil prices, that tends to stimulate production around the world, and eventually it stimulates overproduction. And you know, the cure for high prices is high prices, right? All right. I do want to say also that a lot of these oil stocks lately have been high flyers. They've been moving, and I think a lot of them are very overextended beyond their moving averages. So I'm not just buying when I feel like it, but rather when I see that the market is likely to pull back, I'll probably be adding to those positions. I don't want to be paying more than I need to, and what goes up must come down, or things don't head in straight hockey stick patterns, at least in healthy companies. So when these when oil pulls back, or when these oil stocks pull back a little bit, that'll be my signals for when I decide to buy. Anyway, you guys, thanks for watching. I hope some of you guys found this information useful, and have a great week.